This is 15 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is retired U.S. Navy Commander Kirk Lippold, who commanded the USS Cole on October 12, 2000, when Al Qaeda terrorists bombed the ship in the Yemeni port of Aden and killed 17 U.S. sailors. Commander Lippold is going to discuss his interest in ocean wind energy and the implications of the current administration's recent efforts to stop its development. Commander Lippold served as an officer on other ships before commanding the Cole, and since has taught at the U.S. Naval Academy, held leadership positions in public and private sectors, and at the Pentagon, and chronicled his experience in his memoir, Front Burner: Al Qaeda's Attack on the USS Cole. Since retiring, Commander Lippold has become a highly sought after speaker and a frequent guest on TV news programs. So, Commander Lippold, let me start at the beginning. How did the Trump administration's recent policy actions on Orsted's nearly completed Revolution Wind project off the coast of Rhode Island and Connecticut come to your attention?
Well, Herman, the way it came to my attention is obviously when they issued the stop work order, I was very surprised because President Trump, when he first came into office, signed an executive order that I think really the United States needed. And that is, let's expand our energy base to have energy dominance across our economy. And when you look at that, when you have energy dominance, let's face it, economies run on energy. And part of the reason you do that is because you want to create the ability for your nation to have strategic flexibility, not only economically, but in military as well, so that if you need to project power around the world, you can do that. But when you issue stop work orders, especially on something like the Orsted project that was 80% complete, that seems to run counter to what they initially did. And so I began to question and drill down, why was the administration doing this? And hopefully they will not have any more of those in the future.
They have actually done that with several projects, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But and I also think it's worth pointing out that the Department of Defense is the biggest energy user in the country. I think maybe even in the world. So you don't have a defense if you don't have electricity, and so I completely agree with you. But you recently said the Trump administration's policies are creating what you call regulatory unpredictability. And you said, quote, that's going to drive capital innovation out of the United States and, quote, into the hands of China. Now, China has obviously leapt ahead of the US already, not only in offshore wind, but in solar and nuclear development and electric vehicle technology. But I'd like you to go deeper into how you see the impacts of today's regulatory uncertainty and what that means for national security.
Well, when you look at the regulatory environment that the United States has right now, clearly we're very conscious of our environment. We're also very conscious of our economy as well. And those two, sometimes they run in parallel and complement each other's, but oftentimes they will run at loggerheads to each other, where unfortunately and politically, you end up with one party accusing the other of sacrificing the environment for the sake of an industry, but that industry also makes the economy run, and vice versa. I think when you look at what China is doing, let's face it, China is no longer a competitor. They're no longer an adversary. They are on the cusp, if not already, being an enemy. And when you look at what they are doing with energy and how they're developing it across the board, China is very conflicted. Look at the number of coal-fired plants that they're continuing to build, the fact that they're increasing to burn coal at a rate greater than they ever have before as of today. But by the same token, they're also making incredible investments into the electrification and that technology that drives it, whether it is wind, whether it is solar, whether it's the battery technology. All those are beginning to go ahead of the United States. From that national security perspective, you have to remember that when it comes to running the Department of Defense, ships, aircraft, tanks, field vehicles, They don't run on green energy. They run on fuel. Therefore, if you create the opportunity for our economy to have a broad and diverse selection, if you want to call it that, of energy sources, including offshore wind, to be able to power stuff, power houses, power industries, you're going to be able to then preserve some of that fuel that we can then begin to place around the world in strategic locations that give us that strategic advantage, so that if we do need to apply pressure somewhere, if we need to have presence operations, or God forbid, we actually need to exercise our military in a manner, for example, like we recently did with Iran to prevent the continued growth of their nuclear weapons program, we have the ability to do that. And we have the fuel resources available to that. You create those fuel resources by having other alternative energy forms available to use back here at home domestically, because you don't forward deploy green energy resources in most cases unless you have fixed operating bases, Air Force bases, Army bases, etc. Navy ships, for example, given my experience, we're going to need those oilers forward deployed with an ability to refuel to bring oil out to the ships. I lived through the consequences of having to pull into a port in Aden, Yemen, because I needed fuel and we didn't have those forward deployed resources. I never want that to happen again to our military forces anywhere in the world, which means that creating those green energy sources here at home, in fact, contributes to the diverse energy economy and gives us that energy dominance that the Trump administration proclaims they want to have.
Exactly. We've talked many times here on the podcast about an all of the above strategy. In fact, it's a strategy that most of the presidents that I can remember have advocated for. Um, it's just a fact that in President Trump's executive order on day one, he omitted intentionally, apparently, wind and solar as part of the energy mix that the United States could use. Um, and by the way, it's not just wind and solar. Your submarines run on nuclear power, don't they? I mean, isn't it conceivable that support for the nuclear industry, which is in doubt sometimes here, could make for better submarines?
Well, the entire submarine fleet, you're absolutely right, Herman. The submarine fleet, in fact, is all on nuclear power. We made that decision decades ago under Admiral Rickover to make that transition away from diesel. We still have a number of allies that do run on diesel. A distinct advantage of diesel is that they are exceptionally quiet. The Germans proved that out, as have, unfortunately, the Chinese as well. So when you have that kind of battery technology, that's where that comes into play. But when you look at that, and let me just quickly transition over, we have made huge progress in the development and the technology surrounding what they call small modular reactors, or SMRs. I think that eventually is going to become a very viable source of energy for a lot of folks. And I think that we should try and take advantage of getting that technology, because those SMRs are what is truly going to allow us to be able to have power in remote locations that normally you wouldn't be able to exercise it. For example, when you look in the Arctic and how, because of climate change, you're ending up with now ships are being able to transition that area, not having to break through the ice. The Russians are gaining a foothold because presence is power. And we're seeing that with Russia in the Arctic. We're seeing that with China in the South China Sea and how they've militarized in violation of international law, the 9-dash lines, which are all those militarized islands they have. Each of those have the capability to have SMRs used, as well as other green technologies, because it's very difficult to keep those resourced and energy dependent on fossil fuels.
Another interesting feature of this defense and national security question is that we run a lot of our actions from bases here in the U.S. There's an important Air Force base in Nevada. It uses a lot of solar energy, and it controls a lot of drone activity in the Middle East, right? So that's another example of how renewables can support the military and support national security if they get the right support from the administrations in power.
Absolutely. I mean, you're referring to Creech Air Force Base north of Las Vegas. That is where a lot of the drone activity are controlled and run. And while the drones themselves obviously are forward deployed through satellite links, that's where we control them from. So being able to have that, I mean, obviously, we just witnessed the issue with Spain and how they had not set up the electric grid properly to be able to absorb a shock. Well, that's a good learning point. Don't take that as, oh, see, green energy can't work. This is what happens. We have to figure out the technology to be able to build in the buffer so that if you do have a series of cascading failures, that you can have other technologies that can step in and either mitigate or stop it. And so no source of power is going to drive our national security. You have to have that broad cross section that is going to do that. And that's where, when the Trump administration said energy dominance, we'll never achieve it using one or two forms. You're going to have a cross section. And yes, you're going to have to invest in other technologies. No, it is not this giant scam like some people are prone to be saying lately. I think what you have to look at, though, is all those technologies need to be given an opportunity, and we have to invest in that technology, because if we don't, the Chinese will. They will leapfrog us, and then we are going to be behind the power curve, and they're the ones going to be selling their products to the world, not the United States.
And then that has impacts on our economy overall. I want to mention before, I want to talk about offshore wind a little bit more, but I want to just mention before we move on that we had somebody on the podcast not long ago talking about what happened in Spain, and it is a fact that Europe had a rule that they wouldn't use renewables to help protect against the changes on the grid that were causing that outage. They saw it coming, but they didn't have the renewables to respond immediately. And as a result, their rule was that the fossil fuel plants would respond, and they couldn't respond fast enough, whereas renewables can. But we don't need to talk about that, because we're here to talk about offshore wind. I wanted to ask you, it has this high capacity factor, which means a lot of electricity production is right next to our big coastal population centers. That's what makes it so valuable. You can't put a nuclear plant in the middle of Boston, but you can put wind right off the coast. And also, offshore wind was on the verge of delivering thousands of new supply chain jobs and port rejuvenation, which I'm sure you know something about. But the administration shut it down. So, do you want to see the administration give Revolution Wind and the other offshore wind projects that it stopped the same restart that it gave Empire Wind off New York's coast?
I think they should. And I think that it would help contribute to our national security by doing so. Are there some adverse impacts? Absolutely. I'm not going to paint a rosy picture. Does it have an effect on radar and maritime shipping? Yes. Does it have some effect on maritime life? Being studied, but indications are that it may in fact do that. In almost each of those cases, it can be mitigated. Once you build a wind farm, when it comes to maritime traffic, it gets plotted on the charts. They know that they can either avoid the area, or if they need to go through that, they need to be sensitive with how their radars are programmed, what operator training you give them to be able to mitigate any potential for collisions. In the event of the actual radar for air traffic control in what we call our ADIZ, or Air Defense Identification Zone, off the coast of the United States, yes, again, will it take some software investment to be able to get the upgrades necessary, along with the operator training, to be able to still identify targets that are coming at it? Yes. The other day, when Secretary Burgum made the argument that, you may have a mass drone attack that would take out a number of drone farms, I literally looked at that and almost laughed, because that's an overactive imagination in search of a problem that he wants to solve. The bottom line is that is a false narrative and a specious argument, because if that were true regarding drone swarms, then we better not build any more aircraft because they can attack airfields. We better not build any more piers because it's a fixed object that they can attack. So I don't even know why he would say something that had not been thought through regarding its national security implications, but yet roll it out as if he were some authority on it.
Yeah,
So
well, that's
when I
go
looked
ahead.
at when I look at offshore wind, I think it has the ability to really give the grid a degree of reliable source power, because when you look at the ocean, the wind almost always is blowing in some form or another. And having these offshore farms, yes, you're going to have some folks that like to pull the NIMBY argument, not in my backyard. I want that beautiful, pristine site. But when you look at where they're being built between 12 and 15 miles offshore, a lot of them are out of sight. And therefore, that is not an argument that withstands real scrutiny. And besides, would you rather have lights or would you rather have a pretty picture in the dark, or a pretty view in the dark? So I think that everybody is going to have to look, if we truly want to have a robust economy with the energy resources we need, with the backbone that we want to have that energy dominance, not only here at home, but globally as well, as a nation that has global responsibilities for our national security, then we are going to have to invest in a diverse set of energy, and that definitely includes offshore wind.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't want to be disrespectful to our commander in chief, but I think it's important to note, and we have many times on the podcast, that this dislike of offshore wind that our president has made very clear that he has comes from an incident that happened a decade or more ago in Scotland. That it's just not the offshore wind industry that we have now. It's and I just think he must misunderstand what we're dealing with here. But Commander Lippold, one more question before we go. You've hinted at it in many ways. How does offshore wind fit into your total vision of the U.S. energy mix as a whole? Um, and I have to ask this in a certain way. I've heard you talk about ethical leadership. It worries me that what we're seeing here with this particular contempt for offshore wind and solar, it sort of gets at unethical leadership. What do you think? Tell us about the energy mix as a whole, and if you want to take up that question that you've talked about before, ethical leadership.
Absolutely. The way I look at it is you cannot have a stated policy with an executive order calling for energy dominance without considering every form of energy that may be available to the United States. You not only have to look at what we have here at home, but I think that you also need to look globally, especially at what our main adversary, if not enemy, in China is doing. They are creating technologies, a lot of it stolen and leveraged off of what we are doing here in the United States, but they're leapfrogging ahead. And if they get ahead in those technologies, countries buy based upon their national interest. And while the United States may have technology and some of the best in the world, if China is building a better product at a cheaper price because they've leveraged what they've stolen from us, they're going to buy there. And when you look at what wind energy is doing, we are going to have to exercise that leadership where don't do as I say, do as I'm doing. We have to exercise it and say, if we want energy dominance, every form of energy, including offshore wind, must be included in that package if we expect to maintain that mantle of leadership globally for our future, our sake, and our children's sake.
Well, that's the best place I could think of to leave it. I got to thank you. My guest has been U.S. Navy Commander Kirk Lippold, who's provided invaluable insights into how this regulatory unpredictability that's been created by recent Trump administration actions could drive offshore wind, U.S. energy mix, and U.S. national security seriously off course. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.